I did try and contact Dave Harris and say I'd be interested in having a discussion with him as well. But unfortunately, he was fully committed with a very packed diary this week and said he would be returning in February, and perhaps more members of Tynwald would be able to speak with him then. I'm a bit puzzled why he's here and why now. But there's a dispute in a lot of the teaching unions, and also we have an education bill just coming before us. So in my mind, isn't that back to front? Shouldn't we have the discussion on the future of education before we draft legislation to carry us forward for the next 20 years? But in terms of the exercise, it sounds like an excellent thing to me. And I think, yes, it is right that we reassess the direction of travel for education, and the more parents, teachers, students, everybody who has input into that, the better. In terms of what he was saying about the banal set of exam results and the sort of the league tables and the unhelpfulness, if you like, in terms of the individual's education of that, yes, I fully sympathise with that. I think the issue on the island is that we can't unilaterally say we don't do any formal qualifications, because that wouldn't be serving children in terms of students going away onto further and higher education. We can't suddenly say, oh, you don't need all those exams, don't put yourself through it, because I think we do need them in the current climate. So there's a wider political discussion that's going to happen across us, UK, and England and Scotland have very different systems along with Ireland and wider Europe. But yes, of course, we all want the best possible education system for the island, and I think it's widely appreciated. I'm on record several times now saying, yes, I accept that straightforward league tables between schools isn't the most helpful tool in terms of establishing attainment or even performance.
What's the compromise then? Is there a way that we can have that juxtaposition perhaps of different learning facilities without necessarily making it quite so cold? Well,
I think the issue being, and the reason you get parents and politicians questioning what are our standards, how are the schools performing, and we don't have a very effective, in my view, assessment system. The school inspection, it's not really an inspection where a school head undertakes the first assessment, and then the school is evaluated and peer reviewed, and then once every few years there's an outside person that comes in. The reports that result from that are just not very helpful in terms of defining how good that is as a school. But the feeling I get generally is that a lot of people are content with the standard of education and the ethos in the primary schools. Perhaps something is being lost in the secondary schools, but that might be because by the secondary schools, they go back to the old-fashioned way of drilling to get through exams. And more I'm hearing that perhaps the IGCSE isn't the most appropriate thing for the island, and yet questions in Parliament over that have resulted in the response from the Minister that'll be reviewed in 3 years. I think that was last year. So that's a long time to wait if there's cohorts of students going through exams that aren't really assessing their academic attainment and potential fairly. So that's, I suppose, where I'm coming from. It's wonderful to have the exercise to look to the future of education, but what about the now? What about the students now? We had all the head teachers questioning and eventually changing the exam board for maths. What about science? I think it also happened for art. How fleet of foot can we be in enabling the head teachers who all want the best for all their individual students? How can the department, the politicians, best support the education professionals to achieve the best for them? And with the ongoing dispute, I know that's over pay and conditions, but the general feeling at the minute is education is not a happy place on the island, and that will inevitably have some impact on students. So I do find the timing of the Mr. Harris coming over and having all these conversations, I find that timing very curious.
I believe he's been having some sort of involvement with the education department for the best part of a decade. I'm not entirely sure what sort of involvement that is, but
you'd have to ask, if he's been coming for 10 years, what has his impact been, and what has resulted from those 10 years of being a consulting for the department or being a facilitator for this kind of review.
To pick on a couple of the examples you've spoken about, whether or not the IGCSE is the correct option for the Isle of Man, different exam boards for different subjects, they're all minor shifts within a pretty comparable system. Mr. Harris seems to be advocating a more widespread kind of cultural shift in the way that we bring young people up to be valuable members of a modern society. Do you share his views from that point of view?
I completely understand and would endorse the exercise to take views and to establish where the Isle of Man should be going in the future. I think if you look at how the primary schools have moved away from the UK without having the SATs, that's been a big success for the island, both in sort of selling it as a place for people to work, but also for children. The introduction of forest school to many primary schools has also really opened up and transformed children's learning experience, and also their love of learning, or inspiring, the confidence for exploration and self-teaching and learning. So I just think there are so many possibilities and the areas where the Isle of Man has done well. My worry at the moment is to question whether the resources are being sustained to build on the success probably of how it's evolved over previous generations to where we are now, to say, are we delivering the best education? Is it properly funded, resourced, and the direction of travel in terms of where we go academically? We still want children to be confident, well presented, able to engage public speaking. And I'm constantly amazed by the students that I've come into contact with. But I think that in terms of, at the minute, the structures that the UK and our system feeds into, we wouldn't, and I shouldn't imagine it'd be immediate, walk away from some form of academic attainment, or, a piece of paper that says when you leave whichever education institution, this is your standard of academic attainment.
If Mr. Harris's view is to be adopted, and that the sort of quantitative measurement of success is an outdated model, whether that be league tables specifically or something similar, I think he said it was like a 30 years out of date or something to that effect. How do we assess success then?
Well, I thought that the other comment he mentioned was you have to assess the whole picture. So how happy are children?
How do we do that?
How do
you measure happiness?
Well, there's more surveys, and we know at the minute that actually one of the big areas of concern for me is mental health of young people in particular, and the number of people suffering ongoing anxiety or mental health issues who are dropping out of the mainstream education and either reluctantly being homeschooled or online learning. And is that what we want for people? Because actually the social inclusion and the fraternity of being part of a school and evolving with a whole cohort that you go through, that's something very special to the small community that we have in the Isle of Man.
So should the objective therefore be that the education system serves as many children as possible in a way that suits them? Would that be a measure of success?
Potentially, but I mean, one thing which the Minister has refused to look at and sort of slaps me down when I suggest that actually this inclusion that he keeps insisting we've got a very inclusive education, everybody has to go to their catchment school and their catchment secondary school, and that's going to be enshrined in law, legally enforceable catchment areas in the education bill, as it was the first iteration. I'm not sure that that's right. Previously, parents had the right to opt for a different school if there was capacity. So I think we could lose something. I think the governance needs a serious look at, and in terms of how we measure schools, absolutely some better form of accepting that not all children come in at the same level, and that the rate of progress is the bit to measure, along with happiness, contentment, engagement, whether they're happy at school, all of that. But in terms of the future of education, I can't see that the Isle of Man can on its own opt out of whole mainstream education. I think that would be detrimental to students' futures who are coming up at the minute. And also it sends out, I think it's Jeremy Clarkson famously always says, don't worry if you don't get your A-levels, I scraped 2 passes and look, my private chef is making my dinner tonight. We know that academic attainment isn't all of it, but there is something about the whole person, growing the whole person to fulfil their potential. And that is what the schools do really well. But are they resourced properly? And I think actually the schools themselves, the senior leaders and head teachers, they would probably have very strong views on where the Isle of Man education should be going. So it's important, if that is something that Dave Harris is drawing out of everybody and putting forward a report for. But again, I'm just puzzled why we're doing this now when we've got an education bill that's sort of setting the legal structure for our education for the next couple of decades. So yeah, it's a bit of an issue over timing. And in terms of getting the best out of schools, I think, a lot of people working already within them and the students probably have some very strong views on that already.